Okay, well, so thank you very much, everybody, for the opportunity to speak at the conference today. It was fantastic to be able to be here for this morning's session as well, especially when we were talking about the whole concept of sustainability and running visitor centres in a sustainable manner. As mentioned in early last year, based on feedback that we'd actually been receiving from visitor centres when we were travelling around, mainly feedback around the difficulties that the visitor centres were experiencing with the changing market conditions, a lot of which Jeff was talking about earlier, and also the tightening budgets of local government, we started to scope out a research project, and that was the research project that Jeff has just presented to you now. It was all about investigating the issue of sustainability, and we were hoping that we could provide guidance on how to address the challenges that everyone was experiencing. So our goal was really to develop a pathway towards a sustainable future for visitor centres. At the same time, ahead of the last election, the National Party announced a funding commitment. At that time, they announced $1.05 million of commitment to regional visitor centres, and Terry Redmond MLA said at the time that tourism plays a valuable economic role in the regional economy, and as regional visitor centres are the shopfront for tourism in many towns, we believe this measure of support is important. Many regional visitor centres struggle for funding, and we want to better support them to continue playing their vital role as the first stop for visitors in the town. So we were clapping when we heard that. We thought that was really good. He also specified, though, that it would be contestable funding and that visitor centres would need to apply for the funding. So we were pleased at that time that the research project that we were scoping, it sounded like two minds having the same great thought, was that we needed to do something about it, and that we commissioned the study, and we were hoping that the study would actually provide good background information that would help you as visitor centres actually determine what would make a good grant application. So in May of this year, $2.9 million, as Julian mentioned, was actually promised in the state budget over a 3-year period. So that's between 2014-15 to 2016-17. And it was through Royalties for Regions. Now, Royalties for Regions is a funny beast. I'm not sure how many of you have any experience in it, but it's one of those things that gets agreed in principle at the state budget level. But then it needs to be unlocked through a business case, and the business case is an extremely long and drawn-out process with a lot of consultation across government. We've been working on the business case since June, and following on from the initial promise, it will actually be a competitive grants process, and perhaps the best way to describe it is, if any of you have had experience with the Royalties for Regions regional events scheme that our events team at Tourism WA monitors, it will be in some ways similar to that. Now, if we go on to the next slide, before I get into detail of where to go next for the event scheme, I want to address a couple of issues that will put our discussion into context. And a couple of them have been mentioned by Jeff earlier. The first is, how is tourism organised in Western Australia and who's responsible for funding? So we've all seen this slide. It's fairly standard in terms of how tourism operates in Western Australia. I haven't put on there Tourism Australia, but obviously their role, and funded by the federal government, is to actually bring visitors into Australia. Then each state has a state tourism organisation, Tourism WA, we're the statutory body funded by the state government, and our role is to attract visitors into Western Australia, either from the eastern states or from overseas, and we do that through marketing campaigns and through event sponsorship are our two key ways of attracting people. But we also have a role to play in addressing some of the constraints that hold back the growth of tourism in Western Australia. So we focus very heavily on working up accommodation and the development of accommodation across WA, and also in aviation capacity, both into the state and then also around the state. On top of that, we are tasked with driving some of the key initiatives across regional WA, so such as the Caravan and Camping Action Plan, a cruise strategy, Aboriginal tourism development, and this grants program. And a lot of the work that we do within that regional space is actually funded by Royalties for Regions. Then we have the RTOs, the Regional Tourism Organisations. Again, they're funded by the state government through Tourism WA and also partly funded by their members. And there's 5 of those RTOs, and their role obviously is to attract visitors into a region, but also to cooperatively work with members of the market in those areas. And then at the bottom, and I've got it in a triangle because there's a large number of you, I know at a destination level we have the visitor centres and the local tourism organisations. Now how these are structured and the relationship between them and whether they even exist in certain destinations or not is really totally dependent on the destination and the local tourism industry and the local government in that region, and that's where the funding should come from. So periodically state government does step in. This is a situation like that where the $2.9 million is on the table at the moment, but the overall ongoing responsibility for funding at the destination level is for the local tourism industry and for local government. The other issue I want to address is the role of visitor centres. And to unlock the grant funding, we've been in significant consultation with all sorts of government agencies, all sorts of interested stakeholders from the Department of Regional Development who actually hold ownership of the Royalties for Regions funds, but also to Treasury. And one of the questions that we always get asked is what is the visitor centre's core business? And Jeff touched on this in his presentation in terms of what the research showed, that visitor centres are operating in a changing market environment. We all know the number of digital media outlets and online travel agents mean that they're often providing information as well as booking forums for tourism product and destinations. However, what the research also showed is that visitor centres play an important role in providing information about local businesses, local areas, local destinations and the local tourism businesses. So tourists who visit visitor centres tend to stay longer and they spend more in a region. And as Jeff said in his presentation, travellers see the primary role of visitor centres as providing credible, authoritative and unbiased information. So while tour and accommodation booking capability is important for many visitor centres, it does offer the opportunity for visitors to stay longer in a region and to spend their money in a region. It also offers you the opportunity to generate a source of revenue. To a visitor, it's seen as an add-on because information is the core of what they're after. When we sent out the presentation, there was a two-page document that went with that presentation, and in it was the diagram that you can see on the bottom corner of the slide. You can see from this diagram that really this is showing that there's two key inputs to an average visitor centre. You have the general information, and in our view that is about local governments and local government actually providing or having a community service obligation to provide the general information about their area, specifically community information as well as visitor facilities and attractions, with tourism operators being the other box on that slide or on that diagram who are interested in promoting their individual businesses and selling their products. And visitor centres obviously form that cohesion between the two and act as a conduit. So I want you to hold that thought in your mind in terms of that separation of general information and product-specific tour and tourism information, because I'm going to come back to that diagram or model later in my presentation. So if you want to look here, we have Jeff's 8 recommendations, and he went through them in great detail, and I won't do that for the moment. Basically, we have 8 recommendations or initiatives to enhance the visitor network in WA. And then Jeff also mentioned his 3-tier segmentation model, which looked at the funding and the funding or the trade-off between funding through local government and also the opportunity to generate revenue. So I'm looking at these 9 key areas, and that's how I'm going to structure what I'm going to talk about. I want to talk to you first about those recommendations that come out of Jeff's research, which Tourism WA is going to take ultimate responsibility for, to pick up, to run with, to do these things straight away. These recommendations are not reliant on the Royalties for Regions funding. These are what we're budgeting to do ourselves, and to work closely with the Visitor Centre Association of WA to make sure that it's the right thing to do at the end of the day. So namely, we're looking at recommendations 1 and 4. So that's the communication of the research study, which we would hope provides you with some background information to actually look at your grant programs into the future, and also the establishment of the value of visitor centres in WA, which we believe is really important for ongoing communication with local government. So we look at the first one. So we're looking at the communication of the study findings. If you want to go to the next slide. As mentioned, last year we funded the Haeberlin report, and this year we've actually budgeted to communicate those findings. So last week we sent out a copy of this report, and I know from the conversations in the bus and at lunch that a number of you have had a chance to read it, which is absolutely fantastic. At the same time, Tourism Council WA sent out a media statement with a link to the report, which is now sitting on our website. VCAWA and Haeberlin, between them, have actually funded Jeff to appear at the conference today and present his findings, which I thank both groups for that, because that means Tourism WA didn't pay for that bit. But at the back of the room you can see JT, and he's the cameraman that's making me a bit nervous. That's why I'm speaking really fast. And he's filming these two presentations. And the purpose of that is that we want to develop podcasts so that you're here, there's 50 odd people here today, but you've got staff, there's other visitor centres that haven't been able to make it. What we want to be able to do is to put a podcast together of these two presentations and put it on our website so that we can all encourage the broader network of people to come in and tap in and get this information that we're sharing today. On top of that, as Jeff said earlier, and Julian, we're having afternoon tea after this, and then we're going to have an interactive session where you can ask questions and put your thoughts about what you've heard today on the table. And we want to offer that opportunity to those people who didn't come today as well. So we'll be putting 2 interactive sessions out, whether they're webinars or teleconferences. You can tell us later which way you think that might go down with your colleagues, but we want to be able to say, you know, on Tuesday at 2 o'clock you can dial in here, and Tourism WA and Haeberlin Consulting will be there to actually answer questions, so that again you have that two-way interaction. The final part of this communication of study findings is that we are actually going to have 2 staff available to answer questions through the program, and the staffing is related to Royalties for Regions, but we will have a full-time staff member who is a project coordinator. And for some of you who might know Christine Cole, who's an extremely experienced project manager at Tourism WA and has worked right across regional WA, she will be actually project managing the project coordinators. So both of those individuals, and then Renata Lowe's here today and myself, we're all here to answer questions. Only for the life of this project that this funding and the people is associated with the grant funding. But what we want to do is, because it is a one-off program from the state government, we want to make sure that the visitor centres get the best and maximum outcome from it. So we're trying to get the information out there, enable you to answer questions, and be here to help you get the best grant for your visitor centre. The second recommendation that we want to run with is around the valuing or establishing the value of visitor centres. As I mentioned right at the beginning, it is actually our view that local government should be responsible funding particularly the general information side of visitor centres. But we also acknowledge, because we work in government too, that it's very difficult sometimes to assess the effectiveness of the investment that is put to one side for these particular services, and even really whether a certain destination requires a visitor centre and local government investment. What we want to do is make sure that local government recognises that that it's not about the profit and loss, as Jeff was saying. It's actually about the broader economic activity that the visitor centre and tourism in general offers to the region. So the introduction of standard return on investment figures and effectiveness measures that help them understand the hidden costs, or the hidden value of a visitor centre is really, really important. I say this because at the state government level, we really do focus heavily on the economic value of tourism. When we're talking to other parts of government or to business generally, we talk about the 91,000 employees that are employed in the tourism industry, the $8 billion of money that it brings into the economy in terms of direct spend, the major diversification opportunities that that tourism offers for both WA as a state and also regional areas, bringing jobs, quality of life, vibrancy, through hospitality, through events. And that's why we get and have been very successful at getting royalties for regions money for different tourism programs, and we're very keen that that sort of conversation can be held at the local government area as well, or level as well, that local government understands the power of tourism and also of the visitor centres. So at the same time as having those conversations, we want to actually step up and do a particular research project which will help with those conversations. We want to undertake the visitor surveys. Jeff was speaking about how secondary research, other people's research showed that somewhere between $50 to $100 is spent per person if you happen to be a visitor centre user than a person who doesn't visit a visitor centre. We want to actually get the information that's specific to Western Australia, so that those conversations can be grounded in what's happening here in WA. We also want to be able to find out what part of the visitor service or visitor centre service is the thing that's actually encouraging the increased spend. Because if we can show that a particular part of the service does that, then the conversation is not just about funding perhaps the general information, because that provides good broad economic value, but also the conversation around, well, that part of a visitor centre really does provide this huge impact as well, and local government, you should be taking this seriously. Some local governments do that and understand already, so I'm not bagging local government, you know, it is dependent on the region, but we want to be able to provide everyone with the information that helps make this evidence-based decisions. And we're going to work closely with VCAWA on this, because we want to make sure that the findings of the research can actually impact your specific conversations with your local government. And we want to acknowledge VCAWA as a driver of the change in your sector. And we as state government are stepping in here with this sum of money to support the change, but we want to make sure that you guys and your association are at the destination level and across your network driving change in this area. If we go on to the next slide, we have two recommendations which I've called at the other end of the spectrum. These are two recommendations that we're perhaps not as supportive of major wholesale change, but let's talk about each one of them. Firstly, one is around the current accreditation program, and the other is around the sub-regional management layer. If you go on to the next slide, so Jeff was talking about visitor centres questioning the value of accreditation, claiming that it is too compliance focused versus continuous improvement, and that some of the associated costs with perhaps being open on a Sunday or being open on public holidays might be difficult to justify. And we do acknowledge that depending on your visitor centre and your situation, it can be expensive to operate. However, tourism is the type of business that it is, and we believe that accreditation is an important way of maintaining minimum standards, professionalism and visitor experience quality. For that reason, we don't support a wholesale review of the accreditation program. What we do support is continuous improvement. So we were talking about that this morning, and TCWA is responsible for administering the Visitor Centre accreditation program. They have two levels of accreditation program, and it's important that visitor centres discuss what they need with TCWA to see which one suits them better. At the same time, TCWA recognise that, and we too recognise that you need for continuous improvement, and so a lot of the work that's come back, or the feedback that's come out of the Haeberlin report, is actually being looked at and considered by the Tourism Council. We also at Tourism WA have a policy of only promoting accredited tourism products, so that actually applies to visitor centres as well. If you click on again, I've actually pulled off the TCWA website the list of benefits for accreditation, which I've listed on the slide. As I said, we don't believe there's sufficient evidence to do a wholesale review, but continuous feedback and continuous improvement is important, so the information will go back and be looked at. At the same time, national guidelines on visitor centre accreditation is also currently being reviewed, so there are likely to be change in the accreditation program in the coming period. If we go on to the next slide, the second recommendation in this category was in relation to filling a perceived management gap. So that was providing support, information dissemination, best practice activities and the identification of leverage opportunities through developing a sub-regional management layer. And I've spoken to Jeff further on this. We probably had a long conversation about who should pay for such things. And his initial view was that perhaps this could be something that regional development commissions might be able to fund and supported by VCAWA. I think there's another way to look at this. If you just click on again, and that's in relation to the development of a local tourism organisation at a destination or a sub-regional level, to perhaps run multiple visitor centres or to perhaps run some form of super visitor centre made up with a merger of many and a merger of a smaller visitor centre. And, you know, I acknowledge that something like this, the outcomes could be huge economies of scale and possibly provide the benefits that Jeff was talking about in his report. If you click again though, however, Tourism WA and the state government's position on this area is this, that some areas already do it. They do it really well and it works well. Some areas are thinking that this is good for them, and if it is, terrific. In fact, the activities required to merge, to co-locate, to become a regional visitor centre with a hub and spoke is the way Jeff talked about it, might be something that you can access grant funding for through this program that we've got here. However, if it's something that is right for your destination, that needs to be driven by the destination. It won't be imposed by state government or Tourism WA in terms of putting some form of management layer. We don't want to see additional bureaucracy, and it's certainly not going to come from above in terms of a state level down to a destination. I go back to our firm position that at a destination level, the visitor centres and local tourism organisations, and whether you have them and who runs them and how they operate and how they relate, is the responsibility of the local tourism industry and the local government, and it needs to be driven from the destination. But again, as I say, it might be something that you can look at from a grant program opportunity, which I'll talk about in a moment. If we go to the next area, so we've looked at 4 of the Haeberlin recommendations. There's another 4 that we believe these are areas that VCAWA might like to consider, and I've certainly met with your chairman and spoken about these before. They might be appropriate as well for grant funding. So while the research project I mentioned earlier, which is our going out and looking at the work to build that value of tourism, will help with getting return on investment measures and KPI measures, and hopefully that you'd find that really helpful. If you were looking to develop that into some form of template that each of the visitor centres could use so that the conversations become more standardised, then that's probably something that the association would need to look at rather than ourselves. So too could the development of training modules, which Jeff talked about, or a centrally coordinated branding and promotional strategy for the eye, or the technology platforms that he mentioned as well. All of these, I think, are things that really we can see benefit for, but they are at the network level, and they might, if you think that they're important, be appropriate for funding through the grant program. So if we go on to the next slide, let me explain the proposed grant model, which is how the government wants to distribute the $2.9 million that's available through to June 2017. If you click on the first one, yes. So firstly, there'll be a pool of grants that we're calling network grants, and these are projects that will benefit the entire network. So if you click again, you'll see that this is what came out of the Haeberlin report. So we're talking about training opportunities, marketing, technology, and any other ideas that you feel that you could channel through the association into something that will help the network. Now, I need to specify that these are contestable grants, and VCAWA might not automatically get these grants. TAFE colleges, TAFEs and others have the opportunity and will have the opportunity to actually pull together a grant program and will be evaluated. But I think it's important that you work through your association to work out what sorts of network opportunities will really make a difference to you. Then if you click again twice, there will be individual grants, and these will be divided into either smaller grants or larger grants, and we're very, very imaginative with our names, as you can tell. We've called them individual grants and small, large, and it means that individual VCs can apply. But it also means that clusters of visitor centres could also apply for these grants, or a local government as a visitor centre owner who wants to do something really different could also apply. Because what we want to see out of the individual grants in particular is grant projects that actually change the nature of visitor servicing in a particular area. If you go on to the next slide, and I say changing the nature of visitor servicing because these grants are designed to be applied to projects that are going to make a difference. Haeberlin found that financial viability is the main concern for visitor centres, most of which require ongoing financial support, if you click again. And at the most simplistic level, I mean, to become financially sustainable, you either have to increase your funding or your revenues, or you decrease your cost base. Jeff spoke about that. That's absolutely, you know, fundamental of accounting 101, but how does one do that? And I think that's the key question. So we know there's no one model of sustainability because different destinations and regions have different opportunities, whether that be different opportunities to generate revenue, different opportunities to actually make sure that their local government sees the power and benefit of tourism. Some visitor centres are able to diversify their income through having attractions and commercial activities, while others don't. So whatever the position though, our view does come back that local government has a key part to play in it. So Jeff showed you that segmentation model, and he was actually showing opportunity for own revenue growth versus how much funding that local government would put in to visitor centres. He wasn't prepared when we asked him to, I'm going to give him a slagging off here, he wasn't prepared to give you any ideas about what sorts of models, because one of the things that came out of the research is there's a huge number of different ways that visitor centres could be structured to make a difference. I'm not going to be as reticent. I did a little bit of brainstorming in my team and came up with a couple of different ideas. Some of things you might throw out and say rubbish, and some things you might, oh, that's not a bad idea. Let's have a look at a couple of potential, if you go to the next slide, visitor centre models. This could be one where you actually have a visitor centre manager, you have your information provision provided by volunteers and tourism bookings provided by paid staff. I did this so that we could actually separate out the different types of funding that you might get. So if you're providing information by volunteers, maybe you could convince local government to fund the manager, the premises and the management of volunteers, while at the same time the local tourism industry through membership and commissions might fund booking staff. Another model, if you go on to the next one, is to have the same idea of volunteers and paid staff, but perhaps there's an opportunity to build a cafe or an attraction that can actually generate and subsidise the core business functions. So as long as that third tier, if you like, or third pillar was profitable in its own right and could cross-subsidise, that just might be another way of looking at ways of looking at the funding. If you go to the next slide again, a third one is to look at this concept of maybe going to self-service booking. So Jeff mentioned that, you know, over time, perhaps having individuals selling product when product is often sold now direct might be something that you say, well, I really still want to be have that sales and booking function, but we don't want to fund it through staffing, and we might look at self-service bookings. So having a local industry having the local industry and perhaps a grant from this program could help develop or fund the booking terminal and the software. But whenever you do anything with Royalties for Regions, you have to remember that maintenance on an ongoing basis is your responsibility. It becomes an operational cost. So I just put that out there, that the grant might be about getting the software and the hardware together, but you have to maintain it over the longer term. Last year, Jeff presented an example from the USA, which I think he mentioned a little while ago, around Santa Monica, which actually uses mobile visitor information centres at the back of SUVs that travel around and go to popular visitor locations, a bit like a pop-up option. Obviously, you could even take a pop-up option literally and have a clustered regional visitor centre which offers full service, but then have kiosks that open in other areas during peak periods. So there's lots of different models that obviously visitor centres could consider if you're serious about looking at how am I going to be sustainable into the longer term. And what we want to do is offer the opportunity for you to think that way and potentially then apply for a grant to actually move you along that path towards whatever sustainable model you decide. With Royalties for Regions funding, one of the core elements to this though is that the funding is available to develop a sustainable asset. So it is about developing the asset that you then have to maintain. So you have to look at that in a process as well. Go on to the next slide. Don't tell anyone that, you know, that's what I thought of the Board of Tourism Western Australia. Do you think that looks like our chairman and our deputy chairman? When we sent out Jeff's report, there was actually a little table that went with the report. And if you click twice, that's better. We actually have this little table that said, this is what our tourism board approved as potential opportunities. So securing your ongoing funding could be around, as I said, educating local government, aligning visitor centres with attractions, moving the physical location to higher traffic areas, or implementing local business levies as ways of generating funds. On the flip side, you've got reducing your overheads by potentially maybe outsourcing, merging, amalgamating, co-locating the pop-up visitor centres, or better use of technology. So these were just the broad things that were mentioned, but these are the sorts of things that I want to, hopefully you'll start thinking about when you're looking at your how to access the funds that we have available. If you go to the next slide, I want to look a bit more closely at the individual grant program in terms of what's in and what's out. So if you click again, I wanted to just mention that Royalties for Regions is very strict on what it does include. So even as we start to develop up our program, there's been agreement in terms of what's definitely out of the program. So general administration and running costs are not applicable for a grant. Operational expenses, expenses incurred through the grant application, destination marketing, wages and salaries and activities started before the approval of any grant are definitely out. So I had to say that up front, what's out. In terms of what's in, if you click again, that's totally up to you. So we're in the process of developing this grant program. The idea from our point of view is to not be prescriptive about what could be asked for. The core underlying principle though is that it's what you need as a visitor centre or as a group of visitor centres or as a destination or as a local government owning visitor centres. What do you need to be financially sustainable? The way we're putting this together is that we'll have an independent selection committee which will actually evaluate each application, and they will be evaluated against each other. So it is a competitive, contestable grants program. And the grant program or the grant application needs to justify the request in terms of how this program, funded through Royalties for Regions, will actually enable you to generate this amount of extra income or reduce your costs in this way. So that it does need to actually have evidence behind it and some modelling behind it to show that what you want to do will make you more sustainable. But we don't want to say to you, you know, this type of thing is in and this type of thing is out. We want you to come up with what suits your destination. But if you're building something, I mention again, if you are building something, maintenance of that does need to come out of your operating expenses into the longer term. So this is a short-term grant program. I'm probably running out of time, so what we'll do is we'll talk a little bit more about what sorts of programs you might like to see in our second session after the tea break, rather than talk about it now. If you go to the next slide, I just wanted to talk to you about what's next. So on the table from Tourism Western Australia, from the state government, is obviously the background research that you heard about earlier. You should use that as you see fit. Some of that will apply to you, some of it may not, but you should use whatever you can and what you think works for you. We're obviously negotiating the funding through Royalties for Regions, so as I said, it's been approved in principle, but we're working very hard on unlocking that funding. There are business templates available through Tourism Western Australia from work that we'd done previously in the visitor servicing arena, but also through SBDC, and we thought that it's probably worth looking at those because they might help actually frame up your grant application in terms of looking at some of the areas. And if you're an accredited visitor centre, you'll obviously have your own business plans, but that will help pull that information together to help justify the application. And then also on the table from us is individual support through Tourism WA staff. So we will have 2 staff who'll be available to answer questions and all the work that we're doing around communicating some of this information. In terms of, if you go to the next slide, timing, as I said, we're still working on the business case with the Department of Regional Development and our respective ministers. We don't expect the program really to kick off until early 2015. In fact, the promised funds don't really kick in until 15-16 anyway. So it's a very small amount in this financial year, and then the major funding, contestable funding, is actually in the 2 final years, 15-16 and 16-17. So I guess from now is the time to actually work through to work out what sort of project would suit your visitor centre. If you go to my last slide, so from our perspective, your next steps, perhaps understanding the opportunity for the grant program and how that might impact your business, to discuss with local government and stakeholders. And we would really like to see local government as part of this, you know, because we really believe it's important that they are part of the funding mechanism for visitor centres. So even in those instances where you are self-funding and you don't require local government, you really should keep the local government as part of that, because we'd like to see that holistic approach. Bounce ideas off us if you like, and give us a call. And then over time prepare the application, ensuring you provide the evidence that the project that you want to put in place and that you want funding for will actually make you financially sustainable. Remembering that the grant funding is to help develop a sustainable asset. And so when Visitor Centre WA and Tourism Council put forward their proposition for how the funding should be spent, they both mentioned that, or they mentioned as a group, that it is about providing sustainable assets, and these need to be there and evidence that you'll be financially sustainable, or if not fully, that you're moving along that path towards sustainability. So I hope that the broad outline I've given you today gets you starting to think about the grant program. I'm afraid the exact details of the program are still being worked out. However, as I said, our goal is to not be prescriptive. So we know what you can't do, because that's Royalties for Regions' broad remit. But in terms of what makes sense for you, that's totally up to you. The only thing to make sure of is to always have it well justified.